The vast training hall echoed with a low hum, the sound of alien machinery cycling through its pre-programmed routines. L.R. Vox stood at the center, his 4 arms crossed, towering over the assembled recruits. The Zalcorn general's sharp eyes scanned the room, focused and calculating. Around him stood cadets from various planets, some humanoid, others insectoid, a few like sentient shadows that barely seemed to breathe. And then, there was the human. Captain Jack Hawkins, Earth's first soldier sent to the Galactic Academy. At least, that's what the records said. Jack didn't much care for titles. He cared about proving a point. The alien recruits, many of them veterans from worlds with centuries of advanced warfare, exchanged glances, their disdain barely masked behind stoic faces. Humans, they thought. What could they possibly contribute? Jack didn't need to read their thoughts, he could see it in their eyes. He was the novelty, the weakling of the group. That's how the stories went, anyway. The weak species who had clawed their way to the stars but had no place in an advanced galaxy. Human, General L.R. Vox's deep voice cut through the silence, his gaze locked onto Jack. Step forward. The room stilled, every eye trained on him. Jack pushed off the wall where he'd been leaning. The cool air in the room hit him, but he barely noticed it. His attention was fixed on the floor in front of him, counting his steps to center himself. At least there was one thing the aliens were right about. The galactic training was intimidating. The Zalcorn and others had been bred for battle. Their physical forms were honed for violence. He was outclassed in every way, except one. They underestimated him. Jack met L.R. Vox's eyes, unfazed. What now? The general's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. You're about to demonstrate your worth, human. You'll face Cadet Vorka, a native of the Lithrith system. She's telekinetic and has trained in combat for over a century. I'm sure you'll be a worthy challenge. The alien cadet, Vorka, stepped forward. Her skin shimmered with a silvery blue sheen, and her translucent eyes glowed faintly. Thin, razor-sharp tendrils of energy crackled from her fingertips, moving as if alive. Jack's pulse didn't quicken. He'd faced worse. L.R. Vox nodded, his voice booming. Begin. Without hesitation, Vorka's hand shot out, a wave of psychic force rushing toward Jack. He felt the air crackle, the force of it pulling at his body. But instead of bracing for impact, Jack did what any Earth soldier would do, he moved. Rolling to the side, Jack avoided the first strike, his legs sliding effortlessly across the floor. He wasn't stronger than her. Hell, he wasn't stronger than half the cadets here. But he was faster. He had to be. Vorka's eyes narrowed. Her telekinetic force twisted and bent, her energy coiling like a whip, aiming to strike again. She was fast, but not fast enough. Jack's body moved before his mind could catch up. His elbow jabbed into the floor, flipping him back onto his feet in a single motion. He launched himself toward her, his legs propelling him with brutal efficiency. Vorka's eyes widened, her hands raising to defend herself, but Jack was already too close. Before she could react, his fist connected with her abdomen, fast, precise, and just enough to knock her off balance. Not enough to injure her, but enough to disrupt her focus. She stumbled back, eyes flickering with surprise. L.R. Vox's lips twitched. He hadn't expected that. Vorka, enraged, lifted both hands. A telekinetic burst exploded from her, hurling Jack back several meters. The force slammed him into a wall, and he heard a sickening crack as his back hit the metal. Pain shot through him, but he didn't allow himself to slow down. He'd been through worse, and he'd be damned if he let a little pain stop him now. His mind raced as his body kept moving. No hesitation. No retreat. He'd learned long ago not to rely on brute strength. And in this arena, with these opponents, that lesson was the only one that mattered. Jack pushed off the wall, gritting his teeth as his muscles screamed in protest. He wasn't the most powerful fighter. Hell, he didn't have Vorka's mind-bending abilities or L.R. Vox's size and physical advantage. What he did have was an unyielding will, a soldier's instinct, and the ability to think on his feet. With a grunt, Jack surged forward again, diving low this time. Vorka's next telekinetic strike whizzed harmlessly over him. She wasn't prepared for the speed of his assault. She tried to retreat, but Jack was already on her, his fist catching her shoulder and throwing her off balance. Impressive, Vox's voice came, more a growl than praise. But not enough. Vorka, disoriented but not beaten, spun and thrust her hand toward Jack. He saw it coming this time, predicting her movements. A sidestep and a quick roll, and he was back on his feet, facing her once more. "Is that all you've got?" Jack said with a smirk, his tone casual as if he hadn't just been flung across the room. Vorka's eyes blazed, fury and determination mixing. She pushed herself harder, her hands lighting up with energy as she focused all her strength on him. But Jack wasn't just dodging anymore, he was attacking. Each move was calculated, pushing her further, making her use more energy than she had anticipated. Vox's eyes were fixed on Jack, his expression unreadable, but something in his posture shifted. He was watching more intently now. A change had begun, something Jack could feel, a subtle shift, a crack in the facade. Vorka was tiring. Jack knew it before she did. He could see the strain in her movements, the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. The human soldier had broken through her confidence. With one final calculated move, Jack feigned a stumble, causing Vorka to lunge toward him. She expected a counterstrike, but instead, Jack pivoted and spun, delivering a sharp kick to her side. The impact sent her crashing to the ground. The room went silent. Vox's gaze hardened, his grip tightening on his arms. Vorka lay on the ground, panting, defeated. Jack stood tall, breathing heavily but victorious. Vox's voice broke the silence. "Enough." Jack didn't move, didn't let his guard down. He was waiting for the inevitable. The anger, the ridicule, the disbelief. But it didn't come. Instead, Vox's voice was flat. "Perhaps humans are more resourceful than I gave them credit for." Jack simply nodded. He'd won, no, he'd earned respect. And that was just the beginning. The next day, the Academy's atmosphere was thick with tension. Jack could feel it in the air, a strange, buzzing anticipation, like something was about to break. He knew his performance in the training hall had stirred up the alien cadets. They were proud, some arrogant, and none of them had expected a human to last, let alone win. But that's exactly what he'd done. They'd expected failure, but Jack had given them something else. And now, the question loomed, would they respect him for it, or would they simply hate him more? In the cafeteria, Jack grabbed a tray, not even bothering with the usual fare. There was little comfort in food, especially when his mind was still spinning from the fight. He'd done it. He'd survived their first test. But that was only the beginning. His place here, his future, depended on so much more than one battle. He sat down at a table near the corner, trying to avoid attention, but it was impossible. The whispers were like a current around him, winding through the room. He caught snippets of the conversation, some skeptical, some awestruck. His ears burned with the mention of his name. The human, he's got some fight in him. Did you see the way he dodged Vorka? She barely touched him. There's no way he's a match for a full battle. He can't even understand real strategy. But the words, for better or worse, were focused on him. That was something. A shadow fell over his table. Jack didn't look up. He already knew who it was. Captain Hawkins, came the voice of Kale, a Zenthian from the Oort system. He was tall, built like a wall of muscle, his silvery skin gleaming under the artificial lights. His eyes glowed faintly, an alien light pulsing behind the orbs. He was one of the most powerful cadets in the Academy. That much was clear, even if he made no effort to hide his disdain for Jack. "What do you want, Kale?" Jack asked, his voice dry. "I wanted to see if you were as full of yourself as the others say," Kale said, leaning forward and towering over Jack. "They say you've got guts." But that's all you've got, right? Guts and luck. Jack's lips curled into a half-smile, but he didn't rise to the bait. You'll find out soon enough. Cale's expression hardened. Don't get too comfortable. Luck doesn't last in this place. Neither does arrogance, Jack retorted, his gaze meeting Cale's with a calm that surprised even him. There was a brief silence. Cale narrowed his eyes, clearly testing Jack's resolve. But Jack held steady. Let the Zenthian feel threatened. He didn't need to win over everyone, just enough of them. Cale finally stood, his towering form casting a long shadow. Don't say I didn't warn you, human, he said, his voice low. I'll keep that in mind, Jack replied, his tone casual. He didn't need to prove himself to Cale or anyone else. Actions spoke louder than words. As Cale walked away, Jack exhaled, his mind still working through the emotions of the fight. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he was in uncharted territory. This wasn't Earth anymore. The rules were different. And that was exactly why he had to stay focused. The day passed with a few more stares, more whispers. The alien recruits watched him closely now, analyzing his every move. Jack didn't mind. He was used to being the underdog. Hell, he'd made a career out of it. The difference now was that the stakes were higher, and the opponents were deadlier. By the time the evening training session began, Jack was back in the gym, pushing his limits. He was exhausted from the earlier session but couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. The holographic targets flickered to life in front of him, a dozen targets set at varying distances, some stationary, others moving erratically. Jack dropped into a fighter's stance, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline flood his bloodstream. His first shot missed. His second missed too. Frustration flared, but he ignored it. Focus. One shot at a time. The aliens had years of advanced training. Jack had a fraction of that. But that didn't mean he couldn't win. The third shot landed, hitting the moving target square in the center. He exhaled slowly, a sense of satisfaction pulsing through him. But the next one was a blur, he missed again. Focus, he muttered to himself, taking another breath. He steadied his aim and fired, this time landing a perfect hit. The third shot was followed by another and another, until Jack's hands were steady, his focus laser-sharp. He was hitting each target with precision. His breath was steady, his movements calm, the training kicking in. But even as he honed his skills, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking just beyond the surface, a challenge even more difficult than any physical obstacle. Not bad for a human. Jack turned, and there stood General L.R. Vox, his towering form casting a long shadow over the training floor. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, an inscrutable expression on his alien face. Jack didn't know whether to be flattered or nervous. Either way, it wasn't the first time he'd been assessed by the general, but it was the first time it felt different. Sir, Jack replied evenly, wiping sweat from his brow. I'm just warming up. L.R. Vox's lips curled, a tight, reptilian smile. Don't mistake me, Captain. I'm not here to give you praise. I'm here to ensure you understand what's coming. The next phase of training will be more than just skill, it will test your will to survive. Jack straightened, his posture rigid. I've survived worse, sir. L.R. Vox's gaze seemed to sharpen. You're still not fully grasping the gravity of this, are you? You're not fighting for your life here. You're fighting for the survival of your species. You're a symbol now. Your success will determine whether humanity has any future in this galaxy. The weight of L.R. Vox's words hit like a punch to the gut. Jack had known the stakes were high, but hearing them spelled out like that felt different. He swallowed, nodding slowly. I get it. Do you? L.R. Vox's tone dropped, a hint of something darker slipping through. You'll find out soon enough. The next phase is a trial, one you can't afford to fail. And with that, the general turned and strode out of the room, leaving Jack to absorb the enormity of the situation. The stakes had just been raised. No more practice drills. No more training. The real battle was coming. Jack stood alone in the gym, the flickering targets still in front of him. He clenched his fists. The challenge wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for all of humanity. A voice in his head whispered, "Don't screw this up." Jack exhaled sharply, steeling himself for what was to come. There was no room for failure. The air in the arena was thick with anticipation as Jack stepped onto the training floor. This wasn't the typical simulation, nor was it a drill for the faint of heart. This was the Crucible, a brutal, no-holds-barred trial where cadets proved their worth. The walls were made of reinforced durasteel, the ground layered with a fine coating of synthetic dust to absorb impact. Above, a grid of lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The hum of the containment field buzzed faintly in the background. Jack had heard the stories. The Crucible was more than just a test. It was a rite of passage. The stakes were higher, the rules more unforgiving. And failure? Failure meant being out of the program, out of the academy. It meant everything he'd worked for, gone. Jack's fingers tightened around the hilt of his standard-issue combat blade. The weapon felt foreign in his hand, the weight and balance different from Earth designs. Yet, it was something he'd trained with, day after day. He'd never been the best with a blade, but the truth was, he didn't need to be. Not yet. He took a slow, deliberate breath. His heart rate was climbing, but he couldn't afford to let the pressure affect him. The door at the far side of the arena slid open, and the first of his opponents walked in, a towering Gorok, the brute of a species known for their immense strength and virtually impenetrable hide. The Gorok's muscles rippled beneath their thick hide, and his eyes, glowing a soft amber, fixed on Jack like a predator spotting its prey. Jack's stomach churned, but he swallowed the nerves down. The announcer's voice boomed through the intercom, "Cadet Hawkins, you will face Karka, of the Gorok clan. Prepare for combat." The floor of the arena shifted beneath his feet, the training grounds adapting to the match. Platforms rose up, creating obstacles, barriers, and vantage points. This wasn't just a simple fight. The arena was designed to push cadets to their limits, to force them to adapt, think on their feet, and use their environment to their advantage. Karka grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth. He cracked his knuckles as if to remind Jack of the sheer strength in those hands. "You'll be crushed," the Gorok said, his voice a deep rumble, vibrating through the ground. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't afford to waste time with taunts. He had one advantage, his mind. While the Gorok relied on raw power, Jack had the ability to think and act fast, something that many of the larger cadets struggled with. "Begin," the announcer shouted. Without hesitation, Karka charged, his massive feet pounding against the floor. Jack dove to the side, rolling across the smooth surface and coming up on his feet. He didn't have the luxury of waiting for an opening. He had to make his move now. The Gorok swung his massive fist at Jack, but the human was already moving, ducking beneath the strike and slicing with his blade in a sharp arc. The blade met the Gorok's thick hide, but it barely left a mark. Damn it, Jack thought, the frustration already creeping up on him. His opponent was too strong. He needed to find another way. Karka snarled, lifting Jack off the ground by the collar of his armor. The Gorok lifted him effortlessly, his grip tightening around Jack's throat. "You're weak, human," Karka growled, pulling him closer. For a moment, Jack couldn't breathe. The pressure was crushing. His vision swam, but he kept his focus. His training had taught him how to handle situations like this. He couldn't panic. There had to be a way out. He reached for his combat knife, holding it between his fingers like a hidden weapon. In one swift motion, he plunged it into Karka's side, aiming for a soft spot between the plates of the Gorok's armor. Karka roared, dropping Jack to the ground as the blade pierced deep into the Gorok's flesh. But the Gorok wasn't finished yet. He staggered backward, shaking off the initial shock, and bellowed in anger. Jack didn't waste time. He scrambled to his feet, moving quickly, using the nearby pillar as cover. He couldn't beat Karka in strength. But agility, he had that. The Goric was slow to react, blood dripping from the wound, but still too powerful to be underestimated. Think, Hawkins. Think. Jack's eyes flicked around the arena, searching for something, anything that could give him an edge. Then he saw it, a control panel embedded in the wall, just beyond Karka's reach. Jack's fingers brushed against his tactical comm device. Initiating Phase 2, the announcer's voice rang out. Without warning, the floor beneath them began to shift, and an array of obstacles sprang up between them. A thick layer of mist began to pour into the arena, reducing visibility. The terrain itself turned into a labyrinth of pillars, platforms, and jagged rocks. Jack grinned. "Now we're talking," he muttered. Karka charged again, but the Goric had no way to track Jack now. The mist swallowed his form as he moved silently through the fog. The advantage had shifted. The Goric could barely see, but Jack's eyes had adjusted to the low light. He had the upper hand. Jack darted through the fog, closing the distance between them. Karka swung again, his fist cutting through the air with a thundering crash. Jack sidestepped, his boots skidding against the floor as he moved behind the Goric. He slammed into Karka's back, knocking him off balance. But this wasn't enough. Jack needed to end it. Karka growled and spun around, catching Jack with a backhand swipe that sent him sprawling into the mist. His head slammed against the ground, and for a moment, everything went dark. He could hear Karka laughing, his voice reverberating through the fog. Jack's vision swam as he tried to push himself up, but the world was spinning. No. This couldn't be how it ended. Focus. Get up. Through the haze, Jack spotted a glint of light. The control panel. He was close. With every ounce of strength, Jack forced himself to his feet, ignoring the dizzying pain in his skull. He ran toward the panel, activating it with a sharp punch to the console. Suddenly, the arena floor shifted once more. A series of steel barriers descended from the ceiling, trapping Karka in place. The Goric roared in fury, unable to escape the confines of the new cage. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath ragged but relieved. The mist began to dissipate, and the arena lights flickered back to their original intensity. He wasn't done yet. There was still more to come. "Victory to Cadet Hawkins," the announcer boomed. Jack stood tall, his body sore, his mind racing. He had done it. Against all odds, he had survived. But this was just the beginning. Each fight would be harder. Each trial would push him further. And as Jack caught his breath, his eyes met the screen displaying his opponent's defeated form. The realization hit him hard. The real war was only beginning. Jack didn't feel the victory. Not yet. Not while the taste of blood and sweat still clung to his skin, and his muscles screamed for rest. The arena's harsh lights burned into his vision, but there was no time for relief. His heart pounded in his chest as the announcer's voice rang in his ears. "Victory to Cadet Hawkins." The crowd's roar filtered in from the distant spectator stands, muffled but undeniable. He'd done it. He'd beaten Karka. But it wasn't the Goric that haunted him now. It was what came next. A low hum filled the air. The floor shifted again, and a second opponent emerged from the far side of the arena. A shadow at first, but as it stepped into the light, the tension in the air grew. A Akarn. The Akarn were notorious for their speed and razor-sharp reflexes, a race that could disarm an opponent in seconds, leaving them immobilized before they even realized what happened. Their black skin shimmered, nearly blending into the shadows, and their multi-lensed eyes glowed with a predatory gleam. Jack's throat tightened. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a test of everything he'd been trained for, everything he hadn't yet learned. The Akarn's gaze fixed on Jack, their lips curling into a mocking smile. "I'm surprised," the Akarn's voice echoed in the arena, smooth and almost melodic. "I didn't think the humans were capable of such tenacity. But that ends now." Jack steadied himself, his blade still at his side. His hand twitched as he readied himself for the next round. His breath was ragged, his muscles still stiff from his battle with Karka, but there was no time for hesitation. The announcer's voice cut through the air again. "Cadet Hawkins, your opponent is Akarn Ashkar. Prepare yourself." Ashkar moved, faster than Jack had expected, a blur of black and silver. Jack was forced to dodge as the Akarn launched himself at him with lightning speed. There was no grace in the strike, just pure, unrelenting power. The Akarn's hand collided with Jack's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain. His mind screamed for him to get up, to keep moving. But he didn't. The Akarn crouched over him, those alien eyes narrowing with malice. "You'll never win this," Ashkar taunted, his breath shallow but controlled. "Your body can't handle this. You're weak." Jack gritted his teeth, pushing against the ground, trying to free himself. Ashkar's claw-like fingers dug into his armor, lifting him up with ease. "This isn't over. Stop." The voice was familiar, sharp, and unmistakable. Captain Soren. The Academy's commanding officer, a figure who had become both a mentor and a reminder of the cruelty of the world they were training for. Jack's eyes shot toward the stands where she stood, her arms crossed, her gaze hard as steel. "This fight is over, Ashkar." For the briefest moment, the Akarn's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but it was gone before Jack could register it. Ashkar stood up and backed away, but not without throwing one last look at Jack. "You're lucky, human," Ashkar spat. "But next time, there will be no mercy." As the Akarn left the arena, Jack staggered to his feet, blood trickling down his arm where Ashkar's claws had scratched him. He didn't look at the wound. He couldn't afford to. The pain was secondary now. Captain Soren's voice filled the air again. "Cadet Hawkins, report to the briefing room immediately. This is not over." Jack's mind raced as he walked toward the exit. Not over? What the hell did she mean? The briefing room was stark, lit only by the harsh glow of overhead lights and the glow of the command interface. The walls were lined with maps and images of various alien worlds. He hadn't expected it to be so cold. He hadn't expected the silence that greeted him as he entered. Captain Soren stood near the central table, looking over a large holomap projected in the air. The moment Jack stepped inside, her eyes locked onto him. For the first time, her expression was unreadable. "You think you've earned your place here, Hawkins?" Her voice was low, but the weight behind her words was heavy. "You think one win against a Goric and a Karn means you've learned what it takes to be a soldier?" Jack's pulse quickened. "You've barely scratched the surface," Soren interrupted. "The arena is a game. It's a distraction. Your real challenge is out there." She pointed to the holographic map, where images of different planets filled the air. "Out there, on the front lines, you'll face enemies who won't hesitate to tear you apart. Who won't wait for you to recover. Who won't give you the chance to be a hero." Jack's stomach dropped. Soren continued, her tone harder than ever. "This wasn't just about testing your combat abilities. This was about your endurance. Your ability to survive under pressure. Every opponent you faced, every obstacle you've overcome, was a step toward what's coming." Jack clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "What's coming, ma'am?" The captain's gaze softened, just for a moment. "We've received word from the front lines. There's a new threat. A coalition of alien factions, unlike anything we've encountered before. They're planning something big, and we need every cadet ready." Jack's mind raced. A new threat? Something bigger than anything we've faced before? "We've seen this before," Soren continued, "but not at this scale. We need soldiers who can think. Who can adapt. Not just to survive, but to lead. And that's where you come in." Jack swallowed. The words settled into his bones, cold and heavy. The tests had been just the beginning. What lay ahead was real. And he was about to be thrust into a war that would demand everything from him. "I'm ready," Jack said, the words coming out without hesitation. It wasn't a boast, it was a declaration. He wasn't going to back down. Soren nodded, her lips twitching into something that could have been a smile. "We'll see if you really are, Cadet Hawkins. We'll see." With that, she turned back to the map, her fingers tracing lines that Jack couldn't quite understand. The real war was coming, and Jack would be ready. He had no choice but to be.